Value Impulses, the podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A very warm welcome to the Profiling Values podcast, today episode number 4. It is all about innovation. What opportunities and risks does artificial intelligence pose for personnel diagnostics? Let's first take a look at the value of innovation as such. Yes, it is incredibly important that we develop something new. If we didn't have innovation, if we didn't think creatively about the new things that are possible, then we would still be sitting in the trees today. And on the other hand, however, it is always an interplay between innovation, or you could also say change, and continuity, that which remains in place. And that is why, we cannot just always do new things, otherwise society would fly apart. We would overwhelm it, so to speak, but we need this balance, I would call it, between continuity and change. But the new is indeed very important, and it usually has both bright and dark sides. Yes, if we think of nuclear power, it is evident, yes, we can potentially generate CO2 neutral electricity very, very well, but we can also blow up the planet. And now that we are on artificial intelligence, you can of course quote critical voices who say that it is the last innovation, the last invention of humanity. But there are also very, very many good possibilities, very, very many, yes, quite serious problems could potentially be solved. And of course you also have to distinguish between a specialized AI, or the so-called across the board, that is, a general artificial intelligence. And there are of course people who see this very critically, including Noah Yuval Harari, who also says that with ChatGPT and the like, the operating system of humanity would be hacked. Which of course also presents problems. Let us take a look, at innovation. What opportunities and risks does AI pose for personnel diagnostics, and maybe a few points generally about AI? I have already touched on it. Yes, so what opportunities and risks do we have in general? First of all, what is the definition and explanation of artificial intelligence? Well, the use of machines to achieve human-like problem-solving capabilities. Yes, that is what this is about. And what opportunities do we have? Increasing efficiency and productivity in various areas, if you think about health or robotics or things of that nature. The automation of processes and support for decision-making. And then selecting or configuring the data accordingly to make decisions easier. And as for the risks of artificial intelligence, the loss of jobs through automation is often cited. To be honest, I don't really believe in that so much. In Germany, we already have 2 million job vacancies right now, and the baby boomer generation is just heading into retirement. So we need a huge amount of automation just to manage it at all. And the labor market is so tight that many companies simply can't find the people anymore. And yes, data protection and privacy are still being brought up as well. Yes, it's certainly an important topic, but in the European Union, I'd say we've hung a bit of a millstone around our necks with the GDPR. And that's ultimately a competitive disadvantage when you look at it globally. And another risk is, of course, the dependency on the technology itself. Let's dive into personnel diagnostics now and consider what kind of role artificial intelligence can or already does play there. So, I'll look at the interview situation as such, if you look at it from a traditional perspective. Well, then we have a very traditional form of communication there. Yeah, two people sit across from each other, there are direct questions, there are real-time answers, right, so nonverbal signals like facial expressions, gestures, and eye contact are important and go back and forth, it's, It flows, just as the human form of communication is designed to do. You can provide individually tailored questions accordingly. And you interpret the answers and also the body language on the part of the interviewer, and of course on the part of the interviewee. Today, you always have to keep in mind that the company is also very much pitching itself to the applicant, and it's no longer the other way around, like the employer market was back in the 80s or 90s. So, and if we now compare this classic interview with an AI-supported interview, well, what can be used here? On the part of artificial intelligence, For example, you can analyze the spoken and visual information, meaning words, syntax, but also the expression of the body. There are already a whole range of methods that claim to be able to infer personality from spoken sentences, so to speak. I haven't found any really good evidence for that yet, but speech parameters like sentence length, emphasis, word choice, and so on can be analyzed. Visual data too, like gaze direction, appearance, and so on, all of that can be captured. Of course, there are already AI-supported interviews that, so to speak, use data from a large sample of personality tests, like the Big Five, for example, to then search for patterns and commonalities within that data. So ultimately, it's about developing algorithms for visual characteristics and personality profiles. So, that's kind of the market, how AI-supported interviews are being approached at the moment, to put it that way. Yes, I want to point out the problems right away, because in my opinion, interpreting visual information is quite dangerous, as it has a high potential for misinterpretation. So, interpreting visual cues like gaze direction, whether I'm looking at the camera or elsewhere, can quickly lead to incorrect assessments. Then there are the biases based on physical appearance. People are judged based on external features like height, build, beauty, which is also a factor, can lead to biased conclusions. And yes, the information base, they always say it's based on extensive data from a large sample of individuals, but who are they ultimately, and is there even any validity there? So is this even something with which one? Yes, can even draw such conclusions, or are we heading down a completely wrong path? And of course, including personality tests is something we now have in many recruitment processes and management audits, whether it's the Big Five or profiling values. And they're already trying to use the major personality tests so that the AI develops common patterns through iterative learning cycles. But there are now studies, which I'll mention in just a moment, that suggest the connections between these things aren't really all that simple or clear-cut. So, trying to validate body language using insights from personality tests, well, it's just not as simple as that. As people might sometimes tell you. Now, there's a second approach where human evaluators assess video material. And the AI then learns to capture intuitive assessments, so you're basically combining human and machine and letting it learn accordingly. The challenge for the AI is then to map human intuition based on the feedback from the evaluators. The assessor. Right. And that's where the human-machine combination is something where, in my opinion, something can definitely be achieved. But of course, to what extent the assessors do that is, of course, always subjective, And we have to be careful there, in my view, because it has the potential for inaccuracies due to biases in all this data. And it is, of course, also a complex interpretation. So, deriving personality traits, solely from visual information is quite prone to error. And we also have a source that we'll show in the show notes, Braille, Osterholz, Nestler, and back from 2020. Yes, contributions of nonverbal cues to the accurate judgment of personality traits. So, here are the contributions, or what nonverbal cues, so to speak, have on the, accuracy, the accurate assessment of personality traits. And we see that visual information here contains very little information about personality. Right. So, if you look at the Big Five behind it, we'll give you the source as mentioned. We have stability, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness. The 4-5 bipolar axis of the Big Five. And we see a correlation of between 1 and 5%. So, I have to be completely honest. Between visual information and actual personality traits, it shows once again that you can be quite deceived by body language. And it's very interesting to compare that with the actual correlations, as I just said, between 1 and 5%. But then the gut feeling, how the assessors see it and thus feed the AI, is, let's say, 1% versus 34%, or 5% versus 29%, 3% versus 31, 3 to 28, 5 to 29. So, we humans believe many times over that we can actually recognize personality traits through visual characteristics. And yet the correlation isn't there at all. So, that should make us cautious about the fact that we can train an AI. I've focused a bit on the visual aspect here to achieve this accurately, consistently, well, and also practically in the long run. So, the bottom line is, much more is read into body language than is there, and the AI then naturally overestimates it when it's fed. Perhaps, since I was just talking about human gut feeling, maybe a few more classic errors that come into play when we judge people, for example, the halo effect. I think many people know this, the halo effect, or Heiligenschein in German. So, people tend to take a single positive trait of a person or thing and apply it to their entire image, which can then lead to a distorted perception, because practically this halo over one characteristic you found outshines everything else, and as a result, you no longer pay close or critical attention to other things. Or take the stereotype threat, which is the danger of judging based on stereotypes. So to speak, so the fear then that stereotypical expectations will be confirmed can actually impair the performance of people who belong to a certain social stereotype. So you know, so to speak, that you have this trait, this stereotype, and that leads to reduced performance because you feel like you can't get out of it at all. Or the similarity effect, people tend to evaluate individuals who are similar to them more positively and are more likely to agree with them, which can then lead to a bias in judgment. Yeah, you're from the same region, you studied at the same university, you somehow had the same training, you might have stayed here or there for a while, or something similar. And very quickly, you're caught up in it. And we know that pretty well today, too. There's actually nothing worse for a managing director or someone who heads a department, or even a team, than to pick a bunch of people around them who are just like themselves. At the end of the day, this ultimately leads to everyone having the same blind spots. And we just don't have, we don't have enough complementary skills available to us. So, what's the conclusion here on the topic of innovation, opportunities, and risks of artificial intelligence for personnel diagnostics? I would say, first, interpreting visual information to derive personality traits poses real challenges due to potential misinterpretations and biases. Really, yeah, it also carries real risks of being wrong. And a second point, perhaps, I'd say based on current knowledge, I advise against relying solely on artificial intelligence in the application process. Of course, you can already screen documents and similar things very, very well. That works really, really well. That works really, really well. But then, please, rather use validated testing procedures like the Bochum inventory or Hogan, or even profiling values. Plus, of course, the personal interview as well, to actually put the person and their values at the forefront. I think that the future combination of AI and humans in personnel diagnostics definitely has a future. But I do assume that we won't see a takeover by artificial intelligence here very quickly, but rather that humans in this process of suitability assessment for recruitment, but also when it comes to further development or leadership, that humans play an important role here. Thank you very much for your valuable time. And I'm already fully into the production of the new episodes. See you soon. Bye.